Check 1, 2, 3. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's edition of live stream from the Northeast Georgia History Center. I'm Glen Kyle. I'm the executive director here at the museum, and I'm also a historian. So we wanted to bring to you today an opportunity to ask a historian. Now, this is not an attempt for you to try to stump me and do a gotcha, but I'm here to try to answer any of your questions, especially you kids at home doing some of your distance learning. If you've run up against something that you perhaps need a little bit better explanation of, or want help with some of these broader concepts, I'm here to help. I'm happy to provide it, and we will just go forward. So, Libba, I know we had some questions initially. What were some of those?
That's right. So, looking at our user-submitted questions, we have, let's see here. Can you talk about the Texas annexation?
Texas annexation. That is a fascinating subject, actually. So, in the 1820s, in the early part of the 1830s, what is now Texas was originally part of Mexico. Mexico had had a revolution and separated itself from the mother country of Spain. It had become independent, and it actually controlled a huge territory along what we consider Central America now, what's now Mexico, much of the western United States, and what we now have is the state of Texas. But to encourage settlement in this area, the Mexican government opened up settlement to anyone who could come in and settle the area. So a lot of Americans, a lot of folks from the United States decided to take advantage of this in the 1820s and the early 1830s. A lot of these people who came in were primarily from the southern part of the United States. They were looking for more land to build plantations. They brought slavery with them. And this created a difficult situation because, according to the Mexican Constitution, slavery was illegal. But the Americans were coming in, bringing their slaves, and still operating with them as slaves. And of course, the enslaved people were caught in this awful vice of things. But as more and more Americans settled in the area, they began to want to run that territory their way. And the government of Mexico at this point had been taken over by a gentleman by the name of Santa Anna, who was somewhat oppressive, somewhat of a tyrant. He fancied himself the Napoleon of the New World, and he wanted to make sure that he had Texas operate the way he wanted to do it. He was not a great man, but at least he was trying to enforce that part of the Mexican Constitution which outlawed slavery. So, long story short, those people in Texas rose up in revolution. They fought against the forces of Santa Anna. Of course, this is when the Battle of the Alamo takes place, and this is when the Battle of San Jacinto takes place. David Crockett has gone out there. He is killed at the Alamo. James Bowie is killed at the Alamo. William Barrett Travis is killed at the Alamo. Colonel Fannin is killed at Coleto Creek. And there's a lot of martyrs that come out of this story. So, Texas gains its independence, and for 10 years, it remains a separate, independent republic. It's the Republic of Texas. It's its own country. Well, along comes James K. Polk, a Tennessean who served as president of the United States, and one of his main aims when he was elected was to annex Mexico. Again, sort of summing up things, he extends the invitation to Texas to join the Union as a state. Texas accepts, and it is taken in as a southern state and as a slave state. So shortly after that, the Mexican-American War begins, where America also wants to achieve manifest destiny. That's the idea that the United States should literally go from sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and they fight a war against the Mexicans, and they win. And at the Treaty of Hidalgo, Guadalupe, Hidalgo, Guadalupe, I think so. They see that part of the United States, the Western United States, to the American government, and thus manifest destiny is achieved. And the annexation of Texas was a significant, very significant part of that, and out of it comes a lot of our national stories and our national heroes. Like I said, David Crockett, Daniel Boone, and it's interesting. I know there's people watching from all over, but there's actually a very close Georgia connection to the Texas independence movement. A lot of Georgians actually went out and fought for Texas independence. William Barrett Travis had lived in Georgia for a time. Colonel Fannin was also from Georgia, and he had a group of Georgians that went with him. As a matter of fact, just a little south of here in Gwinnett County, there is a monument next to the old courthouse in Lawrenceville to men who went out to Texas and were killed at Coleto Creek and at the Battle of Goliad. And so right here, very close in northeast Georgia, there are people who went out to fight for Texas independence who were killed, and we built a monument to them right here. Maintain your social distance, but if you get a chance, be sure and go to the courthouse later and take a look at that monument. It's a very interesting link between Georgia and Texas that relates directly to Texas annexation. That's the short version.
Let's see. We have a teacher who is studying Reconstruction, and she says that the kids are struggling with what a radical Republican was.
Okay. So let me back up a little bit to the beginning of the American Civil War. The Republicans were a party founded on union and founded on more or less the abolition of slavery, or at least the stop of the spread of slavery into other territories. And so the Republican Party came on the scene pretty quickly. They only had a couple of presidential elections under their belt when Abraham Lincoln was elected as a Republican candidate in 1860. His election, because of his platform, because of his anti-slavery platform, absolutely split the nation. This is what directly led to southern states seceding from the Union and forming the Confederacy. The Civil War is fought, all right? Tons of treasure. Above 700,000 people are dead. That's just the dead. That's not the wounded. That's not the loss in the southern economy. There's lots of things. It's a civil war. This is a serious conflict that greatly affects the United States. And because of that sacrifice in blood and in money that had been spent on the war, there were groups in Congress called the Radical Republicans. And Lincoln was generally not considered among them, but the Radical Republicans wanted to take absolute control of the South and make the best benefits from Northern victory that they could. They wanted to place the South in a position where they would never be able to rise up and be in a position to counter the national government again. They wanted to make sure that every African American was free from slavery and could benefit and could create their own life and have their own agency. So the Radical Republicans were for confiscation of property of plantation owners and former slave owners. They wanted to confiscate that property and distribute it amongst the recently enslaved, amongst the freemen. They wanted to suppress southern governments and basically have the South be an occupied territory. They wanted to make sure the South could not form its own governments. They wanted to make sure that southern industry could not be created that would compete with northern industry. They basically very much wanted to enforce northern control over that. Lincoln and some of the more moderates, and of course the Democrats who had remained within the United States, realized that a lot of the radical Republican approach to things was probably too much. What they were proposing was going to lead to massive civil unrest and perhaps further armed resistance to American policy. And so the radical Republicans tended to have to back off. In the long run of Reconstruction, they had to back off of a lot of those radical changes that they had proposed. They were still able to get the 13th Amendment through, which ended slavery. That one wasn't too tough. They were able to get the 14th Amendment through, which defined what a citizen was and guaranteed equal protection under the law to all citizens, male and female. And then the 15th Amendment, which granted all males in the United States the right to vote. Not females, but it did allow white and black men both to vote. But of course, after Reconstruction really is the period when the Northern armies and the American government had control over the southern states. Once Reconstruction ended and they removed the United States Army from the South, a lot of the things that they had tried to accomplish in Reconstruction in terms of equality and in terms of freedom in government and for voting went away for about another 100 years. So that's, in a nutshell, what the radical Republicans wanted to do.
Talia, who is 9 and from North Dakota, wants to know, what did people do to survive cold winter?
That's a good question, because nowadays, of course, most of us have houses where we live that have some sort of central heating. Some of us still have fireplaces or wood stoves, and burning wood for fuel is probably the oldest and most common form of keeping warm in pre-electric periods. Of course, a lot of our heat now comes from coal, comes from electricity, but we're talking about a time when it was almost exclusively wood. It's wood burning. People dressed more warmly, right? We rarely wear wool clothing now. I have on this delightful wool sweater because it's a little chilly here in North Georgia, but wool clothing was very common, and you could layer that. You would put on a layer of linen and a layer of wool and then another layer of wool so that you wouldn't have to burn as much wood, because here's the thing, remember that when you're burning wood, all the wood you're burning for heat, you had to have gone out and cut down beforehand and let it dry, give it time to dry out. You can't really depend upon a lot of new cut green wood. So that's how they're able to keep warm. There's also the issue of having to preserve food over the winter. Winter helps preserve a lot of food just because it's cold. It's almost a natural refrigerator outside, depending upon where you're at and how cold it gets where you're at. But people survive the winter sort of the same way as we do, but they depended a lot less on technology and a lot more really on just clothing and being huddled together inside.
Talia would also like to know, what did kids do for fun before her time?
There were no fun for kids back in the day. No, I'm kidding. Being a kid has always had an element of fun about it, and playtime has usually been considered an important part of how humans develop into grown-ups. It teaches them physical manipulation skills. You might have a ball and toss it back and forth. It teaches you fine motor skills. Playing games with other kids teaches you social interaction. It gives you good exercise. So they would play a lot of games, a lot of very simple games, because they don't have access to a lot of different toys. And it's not as gender-driven now, but back then a lot of the things that little girls would do would be things that would help them learn the jobs they needed to know when they grew into grown-up women, like sewing and things like that. This is where they would make their own dolls. They would sew clothes for their own dolls, and therefore they would learn how to sew. Boys might go outside and they might play in the farmyard. They might literally wrestle with the pigs. That's going to get them used to working with livestock and things like that. Now, and again, I'm generalizing depending upon how wealthy your parents were, where your parents lived, if they were farmers, if they lived in the city, if they ran a store. A lot of the things that a kid would do for fun would vary, and a lot of the time frame when a kid will be able to remain young and be able to play might change based upon how quickly they're going to have to sort of put playtime aside and become a productive part of the family. And on farms, that could be as early as 10 years old. By the time you were 9 or 10 years old, you were already, boy or girl, you were already doing a lot of the jobs that were necessary to keep the household going.
All right, and remember to repeat the question, they might not be able to hear me.
Yeah.
9-year-old Louise wants to know, why do we not know more about Sacajawea?
Oh, why do we? Okay, that's a good question. So on the Lewis and Clark expedition, many of you have learned in school about Sacajawea, or Sacajawea, depending upon how you pronounce it. Why do we not know more about her? This is before the time of official government records, right? So really the only records we have of her, the only records, are from the journals and from the letters of Lewis and Clark when she was on the expedition, right? So, and it's not like she wrote anything down. We don't have a single word that she herself wrote down in a journal or wrote in a letter or anything like that. We only have what Lewis and Clark and a couple of the other men on the expedition wrote about her. So that presents a challenge in how we're able to interpret what she did and who she was. We certainly don't know, the things that we take for granted today when we see someone, and we can see someone on a recording, how they talk, how they walk, how they act, how they smile, things like that. We know so little about her. But all that we know is what they left in the journals, and there are a couple of records afterwards where people say, I met the woman who says that she went with Lewis and Clark and she now has 2 kids or something like that. There's a couple of little snippets after the expedition, and of course the expedition ends, in 1806, and that's all we know about her. So and this is a problem throughout history. Historians really want to research about the past, but we're very, very limited by what things the past can leave us. And they can leave us records, they can leave us things in the ground that archaeologists can dig up and look at, but everything we know about the past, especially, starting 100 years and going back, is very, very tricky because those sources may not be able to answer the questions we really want to ask. And the further back in time you go, those sources become harder and harder to come by.
Okay, and can you describe Woodrow Wilson seeing Jefferson Davis dragged through Augusta by the federal troops at the end of the Civil War?
Woodrow Wilson saw federal troops drag Jefferson Davis through Augusta at the end of the Civil War. I mean, I think apparently this did happen. This is something that, Woodrow Wilson, who was President of the United States from oh my goodness, now I can't remember, 12, 13, yeah, 1908, that's it. So 1908, he was old enough to have been a boy during the Civil War. And so living in the South, he saw a lot of different things. I'm sorry, he was president from 1913, that's it, 1913 to 1921. And he saw a lot of things, but he's seen them through the eyes of a child. So he told the story where he saw Jefferson Davis dragged through the streets of Augusta. Yeah, Jefferson Davis was the first and only president of the Confederate States of America. So he was captured when he was trying to escape. They say that he was wearing women's clothes. They said that to embarrass him. That, from what I understand, that's not really true. He may have had a lady's cloak over him trying to hide who he was because he didn't want to get captured. But he was captured, and then he was brought through Georgia to the coast, and then he was brought aboard ship up to Washington, D.C., where he was placed in confinement. He was placed in jail, and they couldn't quite figure out what to do with him because of the whole question of, was the Confederacy a legitimate nation? Was it simply United States territories in rebellion? How do we deal with that? But Wilson did remark on a couple of different things. And you have to remember, he would know firsthand very, very many veterans of the Civil War, North and South, because in 1913, many of those veterans were still alive, and they were going to reunions, and they were getting together and as groups and having picnics and things like that, just like veterans today do. Oh yeah, so early education in America, I'm going to assume you mean like from all the way back to colonial days, and it really only changed about the time we got to the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So much of the education happened at home. This is something that people would have to do because if they're out on the frontier or they're at a farm, there may not be a school nearby. There may not be a school for miles. And so it's going to be incumbent upon the parents to teach the basics of education to their children. If the parents were well educated and patient, and this is the absolute perfect example of school from home and homeschool, it's going to be up to the parents to teach their kids. The parents are going to sort of decide what's important. If the parents can read and write and do some math, then they're going to teach their kids as much of that as they can. It's not all, as they say, book learning, though. It's not all about reading and writing and math. They're also going to teach them the skills they're going to need as grown-ups. You know, how to plant by the signs, how to hook up a mule to a wagon or a plow, how to cook meals, how to preserve food. So education in those early days tended to be focused on what the child, when they grew up, was most likely going to do. These are, in effect, survival skills, just the same way that we teach you when you grow up how to use computers, how to drive a car, how to do physics and things like that, because you're going to need that in this world. Back then, they're going to teach the skills necessary for the student, or for the students and for the kids when they grow up to be able to do their jobs. Later on, as areas became more populous, then townships or counties would begin to tax the parents, and they would take a little bit from each person and have a central school, and then there would usually be enough to build a schoolhouse and pay one teacher to come in and teach the kids. So that teacher in that one-room schoolhouse would be teaching everyone from first grade all the way up through their 16 or 17 years old in one room. And of course, as time goes by and population increases, the schools are going to get bigger. You're going to be able to hire more teachers. You're going to have the students broken up by grades until you get closer to what we do today.
Can you talk about medical advances? What are the greatest medical advances in history?
Oh, the greatest medical advances in history. I think I can, there have been a lot, but I think I can answer that with one word: antibiotics. Remember, we didn't even know what germs were. We didn't even know they existed. We didn't understand the science behind them until the late 19th century. And so people would get sick very frequently, and there was no way to really treat the sickness. We could treat symptoms. If someone got an, again, they didn't know they were getting an infection from germs, but if they did, they would get a fever. They might get an upset stomach. And we would have to depend upon their body to fight it off. So the treatments ideally would sort of help the body fight the sickness rather than introducing something into the body like a chemical or a medicine that could assist in fighting the sickness. So it sometimes worked, it sometimes didn't. It depended upon how healthy the person was, and it depended a lot on their genetics and if they had any, as we say, underlying conditions within their own health. So until antibiotics, it was sort of catch as catch can. When antibiotics came about, we are finally able to introduce a chemical into a system that assists the body in fighting the germs, right? That's what antibiotics do. When you get an antibiotic, you take them and they fight the infection, and that has made a huge difference in how many people get well from a basic sickness. You have to remember, back in the day, I could be working in the barn and scratch my hand on a nail, just like some of us do every day. If I got dirt or germs in that, it could get infected, my hand could swell up, I could get a fever, and I could die from a scratch on my hand. But today we have antibiotics that fortunately take care of a lot of those things. Of course, nowadays most of our advances in as far as technology and medicine goes are diagnostic. In other words, they're not necessarily advances in how we can make you better. They're advances in how we can determine what's wrong with you, what sickness you have. We have MRI machines and CAT scans and different things like that that can look inside your body and see where the sickness is. But as far as how you treat the sickness, a lot of that hasn't changed for about 100 years.
Hampton, who is 11, wants to know when the first shots of the Battle of Gettysburg were fired. What was his name? Hampton wants to know when the first shots of Gettysburg were fired. The Battle of Gettysburg during the American Civil War, the battle lasted from July 1st through 3rd, 1863, at a small town in Pennsylvania named Gettysburg. This was a battle that neither side thought was going to happen. The Confederate Army was in Northern Territory. They were in Yankee territory.
they were trying to find some supplies, and they had sent a small force up to Gettysburg to try to find a place where they could pick up some shoes for their soldiers. If you're marching everywhere, your shoes are going to wear out, and you need to maintain a constant supply. Well, they ran into some Northern cavalry, some Federal cavalry under General Buford, and they began firing at each other. This happened on the morning of July 1st. And again, really, it just started out as a small skirmish. But each side said, oh, I'm running into the enemy. I need to call back and get reinforcements. Well, they would, I say call back. They did not use a phone or anything like that. They would tell a soldier on a horse, take your horse and run as fast as you can to the other general and tell him to bring his troops here. That's what reinforcements are, so that we can have more troops and beat the other side. And they both began to do that, and eventually a lot of soldiers end up coming to this one little town in Pennsylvania. And by the second day, most of the armies, most of the big Northern Army under Meade and the big Southern Army under Lee had come together and had started this huge battle, which turned out to be one of, depending upon how you count it, the largest battles on the North American continent in terms of the numbers of men involved. So that's how it started. After 3 days of fighting, of course, the Northern Army inflicted enough casualties on the Southern Army that the Southern Army needed to retreat back into Confederate territory, and that sort of ended that campaign. But that is how the Battle of Gettysburg began.
Eden, who is 10, would like to know about Nancy Hart, and did she do anything noteworthy after the Revolution?
All right, so Nancy Hart, that's a good question. Let me back up and sort of, in a nutshell, tell the story of Nancy Hart for those of you who may not know. In Northeast Georgia, we actually have a Hart County named for Nancy Hart. And the story goes that during the American Revolution, she was a fervent patriot of the American cause. And she lived alone with just her kids. I'm sorry, she had a husband and she had kids, and they lived in a cabin, but her husband had gone off to fight against the British. And she was in the cabin alone, and up rode 3 British soldiers and demanded that she cook them food. And so she said, oh, well, all right, I'll do that. So she starts cooking, and she says, well, let me just take your guns and lean them over here, and that they'll be out of your way, and you can dine at the table. And so she does this, and she takes one of the muskets and slides it out the window to one of her kids, and she takes all the muskets and does that. Suddenly the muskets are outside the cabin, and the soldiers don't realize it. She says, let me go get you a fresh cup of water from the well. She goes outside, takes one of the muskets, comes back in and says, now I have you. Now you will surrender because I'm a true patriot. They get up from the table. She shoots one of them dead. She grabs a musket, shoots another one, and the third one runs off into the woods. There are not any primary sources that say this is true. We know that there were a lot of instances of little bitty things like this in the back country, not in the civilized part of where the revolution takes place close to the coast, but further in the back country where it's less settled and there's not as big a population. So we don't have a primary source, but here's an interesting thing. They found where they think Nancy Hart lived. A few years back, they located a grave, and they exhumed 2 bodies from the grave. And the bodies had military buttons that had been buried with them that had been on their uniform. So maybe, as the legend goes, she did bury those 2 men on her property. We don't really know. What happened to Nancy afterwards, I'm not exactly sure on that. She did continue to be, she certainly got the reputation of having been a firm patriot. There's no question that she was a firm patriot, but I think that she tended to be seen as very much a local hero, very much a strong woman who was willing to fight for a cause, and she never denied any of those stories that started up about her.
Do you happen to have any information on the Magnolia Cemetery in Augusta, Georgia?
I will confess that I know absolutely nothing about the Magnolia Cemetery in Augusta. I'm very sorry about that. You may have to Google up that one, or if they're open, the Augusta Richmond County Museum in Augusta, I'm sure you could email them or give them a call, and they would probably be happy to give you some information about that. They're a great museum if you haven't been there.
Emily says, my kids are interested in learning more about D-Day.
D-Day. I think, or had we talked about doing a broadcast later on about D-Day? We've been talking about that, adding that to our series. But, oh, goodness. There have been books and books and books written about D-Day. But let me give you, are y'all tired of hearing me say in a nutshell? That's sort of what I'm doing. In a nutshell, D-Day is the invasion of Europe by the British and American forces. So the Germans under Hitler had taken over most of Europe and had controlled much, including France. Italy was their ally. Spain was neutral. And a lot of the Scandinavian countries they had taken over. And there was no way for the Allies to fight against Hitler and the Germans on land. All they could do was use air power, because the Germans had fortified Europe so strongly. So they had gone south. They had did some fighting in North Africa. They had done some fighting in Italy, but everyone wanted to get at the Germans in Europe. So for about a year and a half, they had come up with these incredibly complex plans. They had produced planes and tanks and very specialized Navy craft so that they could just take the soldiers and the tanks and the vehicles and drive them right up onto the beach and drop ramps and go across. This was a very complex situation, and the Germans knew it was coming. They knew that the Allies were coming. They just didn't know exactly where, right? They couldn't quite figure that out. So when it did come, the Allies were able to get ashore. And because of a lot of different factors, the Germans thought, well, maybe this is just a diversion. Maybe this isn't really where they're going to try the hardest, because the Allies had some resistance on that first day. It took a little while, but on June 6, 1944, with airborne troops and the largest naval armada that had ever been assembled and tens of thousands of troops, they finally did go ashore on D-Day. And remember, it's not just about D-Day. D-Day is just the first day when they get ashore. And those first soldiers ashore have to keep pushing from the beach and going inland so that more soldiers can land and go in, so that more soldiers can land and go in. So this is a big operation. D-Day is just the first day. And it's interesting, so there's a lot that can be said about that, and we can do a single program on this later, so be sure and watch for that. But one of the important things to note is not only the bravery of the soldiers that were there on D-Day, but the training and the intelligence, because generals had planned this huge operation since day one, and it was very complex, and pages and thousands of orders went out. And when they hit the beach, everything fell apart, because the Germans are good soldiers and their army was good. And when they hit the beach and all the plans fell apart, they were landing in the wrong place, the equipment wasn't where it was supposed to be, they could have very easily failed on D-Day. The Americans and the British could have failed on D-Day, but what happens is those sergeants and those soldiers take command and they say, you know what, we're here to do a job, we're going to do the best we can, so you men back there, follow me, and we're going to go inland. And that's what made D-Day work. It wasn't the grand generals and the grand plans that was important, but what made D-Day work were those soldiers, that, as we say, those boots on the ground that took the initiative to move forward, do the best that they can, and get onto that beach and make the beach available for more troops coming on. So that's D-Day.
Very good. Owen, who is age 6, would like to know more about Clara Barton. So can you talk about her role?
I can talk a little bit about Clara Barton. So during the American Civil War, hopefully some of you tuned in yesterday when Marie Walker was here talking about nurses during the Civil War. And you can go, don't go yet, but on Facebook, after this broadcast, you can go see her broadcast. But Clara Barton was someone who wanted to do a lot to help the wounded soldiers in the American Civil War, both North and South. She was a Northerner herself, so her efforts were focused on the North. But one of the things that Clara Barton did, following in the footsteps of Florence Nightingale, who was a British lady who had sort of professionalized nursing, Clara Barton took those ideas and brought them to the United States and sort of made them the standard in the American armies. And that was that it's not just someone who shows up and sort of tucks soldiers in after they've been taken care of and runs and gets water. She wants to make nursing a profession. She wants to make it a calling where they get training. There is education that takes place for the nurses. They learn the basics of medicine, how to do their job. They maintain cleanliness. They dress appropriately, and they are a unit that sort of moves with the Army. In the South, it very much depended upon the local people. If you were in a town where a battle happened, the women would come together. They would sort of help the doctors in that area with the wounded, and then when the armies left and went on, they sort of went back home. In the North, there were professional nurses that followed the armies with the medical staff, and Clara Barton was very much one of the leaders in that, and that's why today, she's considered sort of the mother of American nurses, and she also was instrumental in developing, not developing, but sort of getting the Red Cross going.
Very good. Let's see. Maggie would like to know, did Betsy Ross really sew the first American flag?
Oh, Betsy Ross and the American flag. She sewed an American flag. So they say that she came up with the design. That's probably not totally accurate. Here's how we got the United States flag. There was a Liberty flag, which was just one big flag with nothing but red and white stripes on it, right? Imagine an entire flag of nothing but red and white stripes. Then the feel that we think of with a modern flag, the blue with the stars that represent the colonies, that at the time, that flag was Washington's headquarters flag. All right, so they sort of combined those two into a typical classical American flag that you see the 13 stars and stripes, 13 red and white stripes with a blue field with 13 stars. That was sort of Washington's Guards flag. That was not a universal, everyone in the Continental Army used that flag. The flags could be made by anyone, anywhere, and as long as they were sort of in the same color scheme or reflected the spirit of the unit with which they were attached, that was considered an acceptable battle flag, a unit flag. So it's a little, and I honestly can't quite pin down exactly what Betsy Ross's role was in creating the flag. I can tell you that it is not the legend of George Washington going to her and saying, "Betsy Ross, will you sew me a flag?" And she stays up all night and sews the flag and presents a very modern American flag to him the next morning. That is not what happened.
All right. Eli, age 8, wants to know about doll houses. Were they common, or when did they become common? What did they look like? What were they made of, if you happen to know?
Someone wants to know about doll houses and when they first came into being, how were they built, what were they made of, things like that. Now, doll houses are kind of fancy things. Not everyone would have a dollhouse. Doll houses were made. There are some excellent examples from the 16 and 1700s that belonged to literally princesses, the daughters of a king and a queen, and they were very, very perfectly made, literally miniature houses. Some of them had running water on the inside, and they would have little servants and little hand-woven rugs to take the place of the rugs. Again, that's a toy of a very rich little princess. Actual doll houses were not that common until you get until the mid-20th century. So doll houses, the people knew what they were, but again, they take a lot to make, and a little girl might have her cornhusk doll and maybe make some sticks out in the yard, and that's the cabin that looks just like her parents' cabin. But as far as like, say, factory-made and mass-produced doll houses, that's very much a 20th century thing where industrialization had come along to the point where they could sort of mass-produce them as toys. And once you're able to mass-produce those as toys, a lot more people have access to them because they're less expensive to produce, therefore they're less expensive to purchase.
Can you describe the shortest and longest wars in history?
Let's see, can I describe the shortest and longest wars in history? Whoa. I'll just say here's the longest war, and it's called the 100 Years' War. Um, it didn't really last 100 years. It was really the struggle between England and France to control the French crown, and this takes place from the 1310s, 20s to about 1440. It's very vague. The actual amount of fighting that takes place certainly it isn't 100 years of constant fighting, but they have battles, and almost all the battles are in France when England goes over and tries to take over the French crown. And they almost make it, but not quite. But those two countries go back and forth fighting each other for a long time, and and that's sort of what leads to a lot of animosity between England and France. And again, it's hard to define that as a war that takes place. Skipping ahead a little bit, there's the 30 Years' War in Europe, which is massively destructive, which leads to an incredible loss of life, which, as far as an actual war, is probably about the best example of a long war. The shortest war, that's a tough one. If you're actually talking about bigger armies coming together and fighting, probably one of the shortest wars is Operation Desert Storm in 1991, when American forces freed Kuwait from Saddam Hussein. It's called the 100-Hour War. Now, there had been aerial bombardments for a few weeks before that, but as far as the actual ground forces involved, it lasted, let me think, 100 hours. What is that? 4 days. It's a little over 4 days between the time the ground forces began fighting and the surrender of the Iraqi forces. So that's not a very long war at all, especially when you consider there were hundreds of thousands of soldiers that were involved in that.
Taryn is interested in learning more about our involvement in Vietnam.
Taryn, you're interested in Vietnam. I'm going to hold off on that for just a second. We were involved in Vietnam, but is it Monday?
I think it's as soon as Monday. Let's see, check our events.
Yeah, check our events. We're actually going to have one of our live stream broadcasts at 2 about soldiers in the Vietnam War and American involvement. So that's coming up this coming Monday, which is April the 7th? No.
Let me check our schedule.
Check our schedule.
So we have Vietnam is going to be on Monday the 6th.
Yes, Monday, April 6th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard. We're going to have a whole program on that. So if you'll be patient, and forgive me for not answering right away. I don't want to spoil too much of our presentation then, but please tune in and we'll cover that more.
Okay. Can you talk about how John Wilkes Booth was caught?
John Wilkes Booth. How was he caught? So he was the assassin, the man who killed Abraham Lincoln. And it's interesting, there was actually an entire plot to kill not only Lincoln, but several members of the head of the U.S. government. And if this had all gone forward, there's no telling what could have happened. They were killing the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Treasury, the President, the General of the Armies. They were supposed to kill General Grant all in one night at the same time. What ends up happening is that a lot of the conspirators decide they're afraid of getting caught. They don't want to go through with it. They're afraid. And the only one who really goes forward with what he's supposed to do is John Wilkes Booth, an actor. And so he was performing a play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. He sneaks up behind Abraham Lincoln. He shoots him, and he leaps from the presidential area down onto the stage and gets his boot caught in some of the draperies and breaks his leg. He jumps on a horse and rides away. Lincoln doesn't die immediately. He dies several hours later. And of course, one of the largest manhunts in American history takes place. He's, as I said, his leg's broken, so he rides, and he has to hide out. Well, he finds a doctor who's willing to treat him. The doctor doesn't quite know who he is or what he's done. All he sees is a wounded man. Well, come with me. I'm not sure why you're hiding in this barn, but I'll still go ahead and treat you. And he treats his leg. And soldiers do eventually find him. They capture John Wilkes Booth. And John Wilkes Booth, confesses and tells them who the other conspirators are. And they gather them all together, and they are eventually hanged as a result. Now, this is where you may have heard people say, well, my name is Mud. that's where this comes from. The doctor that treated John Wilkes Booth was Dr. Mudd. And when people found out that he had given aid, even if it's part of his oath as a doctor, that he had given aid to someone who had killed our beloved president, people hated him. And he was not able to practice as a doctor again. No one wanted to have anything to do with him. They couldn't convict him for having aided, for having done what he did to heal his broken leg. But nevertheless, when people found out who he was, they didn't want to have anything to do with him. So my name is Mudd. That's where that comes from. And that's, in effect, the short story of what happened with John Wilkes Booth after the assassination.
Can you talk about the history of nuclear weapons?
Can I talk about the history of nuclear weapons? I can tell you that there have only been 2 used in anger. They have both been used by the United States against Japan in the last days of World War II. Nuclear weapons, here's one of the things that makes them what they are. We've had artillery shells and bombs that fall from airplanes and things like that, and they all explode and they can all cause damage, but they're all based on sort of TNT, sort of a smaller explosive. The thing with nuclear weapons is within the same amount of space that you would take a regular bomb that might only blow up a single building, the technology within it, the nuclear technology, can create an explosion that can destroy not just a building, but an entire city with one bomb. That's the trick of nuclear weapons. And so if you have more of them, the destruction can become very, very big. Not to use this as too much of an example, but we were talking about D-Day, right? D-Day was able to have so many ships in one place because no one bomb could destroy the D-Day Navy. If there had been a nuclear bomb, you could drop one bomb in the middle of that Navy and the entire D-Day operation is off. So they become very powerful. The fear was that our enemies in World War II, especially Germany, was going to develop this weapon. And so to counter that, we, the Allies, had to develop it first. And so this is an incredibly complex thing, not just in terms of the science, but the technology and the industry required to create such a bomb. And so we do develop the bomb. Germany surrenders before we have to use it on Germany, but the United States, and this is a very complex issue, decides to use the bomb to shorten the war against Japan. They dropped the first one on August 6th, 1945 on Hiroshima. On August 9th, they drop one on Nagasaki, and Japan surrenders. Now, at that moment, the United States is the only country that has a weapon that's this powerful. But of course, everyone wants this weapon so that the United States won't bully them, so that they can also be considered a powerful nation. So the Soviet Union gets nuclear weapons, and then you have what's called the Cold War. For about 40 years, the United States and the Soviet Union are sort of against each other, and they're afraid that one is always afraid that the other is going to use nuclear weapons and use them first. So it's a very tense time when we're all afraid of how these weapons are going to be developed and how they're going to be deployed. We use planes. We can use planes to drop atomic weapons. Atomic and nuclear are the same thing, basically. We can use submarines to launch missiles from beneath the ocean. We can use land-based missiles to launch nuclear weapons into other countries and things like that. But that's sort of was always a fear. But with the fall of the Soviet Union, countries using massive amounts of nuclear weapons all at once has more or less become less of a danger than 1 or 2 nuclear weapons being used. But again, if one can destroy an entire city, that of course is of great concern. Nuclear weapons still exist, but nuclear weapons are generally not being developed as they were.
Can you talk to us about the Red Cross, and specifically, why was it called the Red Cross, and why the logo that they have?
So the Red Cross was formed first as a type of aid to soldiers in war, and it's a private entity. It's not run by the government or any government, and the actual Red Cross symbol was chosen because it was founded by folks who were Christians, and Christianity has as one of its basic tenets the idea of helping a neighbor and of being merciful and of always providing aid when one can. And so the cross is seen as a sign of peace. It is seen as a sign of help. And so when they made it red, they just decided to sort of make a red cross as a very visible form. And so the Red Cross actually has, I want to say they have sort of a copyright issue on when that red cross can actually be used. But of course, we see that nowadays in the military, medics and doctors and things like that are meant for medical help on the sides of ambulances, on the tops of medical tents and things like that. First aid. When you see that sort of means health and first aid and medical treatment and things like that. But the Red Cross proper is still a private entity. They work very closely with governments, and they still have a lot of different ways they can help soldiers in wartime. They have a lot of different ways they can help people if there's a natural disaster. And because the cross is a Christian symbol, some other countries who may not be predominantly Christian have also adopted this model. So, for example, in Muslim countries, they have the Red Crescent, which is the exact same model as the Red Cross. They help with natural disasters and in time of war. They themselves do not fight, but instead of a cross, they have, a crescent, because that reflects the majority religion in those areas.
Cool. So Maggie had a great-great-grandmother who was born in Maysville, Georgia, very close to Gainesville. Can you talk about the Gainesville area in the 1900s, maybe the trains or the resort towns?
Right. So in Gainesville and sort of this area, in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and even during the American Civil War, was still very rural. It was not terribly developed in terms of the economy. Probably the most developed area in northeast Georgia was Dahlonega because of the gold mining and later lead mining that took place up there, because of the industrialization of mining that took place. So Dahlonega was sort of the place to be. Most of that changed in 1871 when the railroad comes not to Dahlonega, but to Gainesville. And when the railroad comes to Gainesville, that sets up an entirely new situation in terms of people can now take their crops, put them on a train, send them south, and they're able to sell them easier. They're able to sell them for more money because the markets have opened up. And when you're able to make more money, you're going to have a demand for better education, better goods, and things like that. And those are things that can come north into town on the railroad. So very, very quickly after 1871, Gainesville starts to develop as the social and political and especially economic center of the entire region. And so by the time you get to 1900, the railroad's been here for about 30 years at that point, and it has become not just the one railroad that comes to Gainesville, but of course the railroad has expanded out from Gainesville in several directions, which makes Gainesville, it maintains its place as an economic center because it is now a railroad hub. And a lot of the businesses that you see, like banks and stores and things like that, tend to grow up in Gainesville and grow out from Gainesville. So a lot of the smaller towns, like Lula and Gillsville and things like that, still, even though the railroad doesn't come directly to those towns, they're close enough to it to cause that kind of prosperity to happen throughout the area. And that's even before the growth of the poultry industry. Well, I haven't even touched on that yet.
We'll take two more questions. The
Sure.
first one is from Eli, age 8, who is interested in the history of card collecting. Can you talk about when collecting cards became popular, what kinds of cards were collected, or maybe just collecting in
Yeah, so cards, collecting cards. I bet you collect baseball cards. Baseball cards are very popular. I know my brothers used to collect those things like crazy, and I could never understand it. But they loved them. Some of the first baseball cards came out. They were sold with. Actually, let me back up. So Honus Wagner is the first baseball player to ever be put on a card and sold. And so since that's the first one, it's very, very valuable. It's very, very rare. I've actually seen one when I did some work up at the Baseball Hall of Fame. But people started to put those, and people love baseball. They love sports, and so this was a way for them to get their favorite player, and it had statistics and a little bit about them on the back. And actually, it's interesting, a lot of times, nowadays the baseball cards will come with a stick of gum inside. Originally, they were trying to sell the gum. And to sell the gum, they said, well, you know what? If you buy our gum, we'll put just one baseball card in the pack of gum so that will encourage you to get the gum. Well, people picked up on those cards immediately and began getting all that they could. And because bubble gum was marketed at young people, the cards became very common collectibles among young people. It was something they could afford. It was something they could interact with, and you could trade and get with your friends groups and things like that and just start to accumulate those collections. And people began collecting those like crazy. And probably the heyday of card collecting was around the 90s, 80s and 90s, when they were just everywhere. I saw, even in my little hometown of Blue Ridge, there were a couple of different stores whose only purpose was to buy and sell trading cards. And we may even have someone watching now who did one of those. Toby, are you watching? But not just baseball cards. A lot of companies began to do cards of different movies, of television shows, and things like that. But I think that the sports cards are definitely there within have always been the core.
All right, and we'll end today with Adair's question. They are 8 years old. They want to know, why did you want to be a historian?
Why did I want to be a historian? First of all, I just loved history. I started reading books. My parents were wonderful people. My dad would always watch history movies and war movies with me. My mother never denied me a book that I wanted. Those books tended to usually be about history. And so as a child, I always was fascinated by the stories and the past. And, I would go and read the World Book articles on stuff like this. And so as I got older and older, I realized that, there may not be a lot of money in history, but it was really something that I enjoyed. But when I was in high school, I thought, well, maybe I need to look into a career that might provide a little bit more of a more significant income, let's say. So I was going to be an engineer. And my parents, again, were supportive. They said, you do whatever you want to do. And I remember one day, after my first year at Georgia Tech, I was just sort of lost, and I had gone back to visit some of my teachers at my high school, and one, Ms. Sandra Burlingame, said, well, what's wrong? And I said, I just don't know what I want to do. And she said, well, what do you want to be? And I said, well, you'll laugh. And she said, no, tell me. I said, I want to be Indiana Jones. And without batting an eye or cracking a smile, she said, well, then do it. And so I did. So I changed my major to history, followed my heart, and continue. I got a degree, and now I have a master's. Now I work with great people here at this history museum, and so it's really fun to be able to follow your passions. So whatever your passions are, whether they're history, whether they're math, whether they're art, any of those things, if there's always a way you can find where you can make a living doing it, and you can perhaps reach and inspire other people. And that's one of the great things about being a historian, is being able to talk to people and share the knowledge that I've gained with others. And even though Libba said this is the last question, I suppose that it should be, but I could sit here for hours and just listen to y'all's questions and talk to you. But we've got to end. Apparently, we're about out of time. We've gone a long time. So thank you so much for tuning in. Thanks for continuing to watch these live streams with us. We enjoy doing them. We hope you are able to get a lot out of them. Thanks for tuning in to the Northeast Georgia History Center. And as always, if you can give us any help that you can, please go to our website and click on that donate button in the upper right-hand corner. We can always use the help, but we're going to be here through these trying times. So until then, until we see you tomorrow, take care.